On a hot afternoon in August 1944, a P-51 Mustang rolled in low over occupied France, exactly where German gunners wanted it. Lieutenant Royce, Deacon, Priest, saw it happen from off the wing. His squadron commander's aircraft shuddered, lit, and started trailing fire. The Mustang didn't explode cleanly. It bled smoke, lost height, and slid toward a patchwork of wheat fields beyond the tree line, well behind German lines. Priest was young, new to combat, and still learning what the manuals didn't teach. But the man going down wasn't just another pilot. It was Bert Marshall, the commander with the reputation, the confidence, the aggressive instincts Priest had been trying to emulate since he arrived. The formation had been set up. German crews had gotten frighteningly good at turning everyday objects into weapons. A hedgerow became a gun pit. A barn became a firing point. A haystack became a trap. On this day, the ambush hid inside a rail car. Boxy, ordinary, easy to ignore, until the sides dropped and the barrels were already tracking. When Marshall led the flight in for a strafing pass, the guns opened at brutal range. It wasn't the scattered flak bursts you could dodge. It was direct, aimed, low-altitude fire, 20 millimeters and 40 millimeters tearing the air where Mustangs had to fly. In the summer of 1944, pilots were being lost fast. Some died immediately, some crash-landed and were marched into prison camps. Others vanished, swallowed by occupied countryside, with nothing but rumors left behind. Marshall didn't have to be in the lead that day. As squadron commander, he could have handed the job to someone else. But he had a habit, maybe a flaw, of being out front. It was part of why the squadron respected him, and it was part of why he was now falling in flames. He was the kind of officer whose story spread quickly. He had transitioned into the P-51 with minimal time in the type and still produced results almost immediately. In a matter of weeks, he was an ace, then a commander, then the pilot everyone looked toward when things went wrong. Now things had gone wrong in the worst possible place. Priest watched the Mustang descend and read the signs the way every fighter pilot learns to. A hit to the cooling system, a wounded Merlin, minutes left at best. Marshall's aircraft disappeared below the tree line. The correct response was simple: mark the location, radio it, get out, and let rescue networks and luck do the rest. But that correct response had a cruel subtext. It assumed the downed pilot would have time to hide, evade, link up, and survive long enough for someone to reach him. Priest didn't like those odds. He pushed the nose down and started after him. The radio crackled. Marshall was ordering him to stop, abort, climb, head back toward friendly skies. It was a lawful order in combat, delivered by the man he was trying to save. Priest could have answered. He could have acknowledged and turned away. He didn't. A P-51 was a thoroughbred, built for runways, not farmland. The cooling system sat vulnerable. The landing gear was not meant to bite into soft earth. The wrong bump could fold a strut and flip the aircraft. The wheat itself could become a hazard. Tall stalks, hidden ruts, rocks that didn't show until you were on top of them. Priest trimmed for the best landing he could hope for, dropped flaps, slowed to a careful approach speed, and aimed for the longest ribbon of open wheat he could see. His view forward disappeared behind the Mustang's nose. He judged the glide by peripheral cues, by the rush of stalks, by the angle of the horizon, by experience that had never been meant for this. The wheels hit harder than any runway landing. The aircraft bounced, settled, and carved ruts into the field. Wheat thrashed against the fuselage as he braked, trying to keep it upright, trying not to dig in and pitch forward. When the Mustang finally stopped, Priest didn't waste time. He turned the aircraft immediately, swinging the nose toward the direction he would need for takeoff. If Germans arrived, and they would, he couldn't afford to spend precious seconds repositioning. Above, 2 other Mustangs circled, stunned. Then they started scanning. Roads, hedgerows, farm tracks. That's where the danger would come from. It came almost at once. A truck appeared on a dirt road and accelerated toward the field. Canvas over the bed meant infantry. The shape and speed suggested urgency. Someone had seen the crash, or heard it, or both. The circling Mustangs rolled in without hesitation. Their .50 caliber guns stitched the road, walked tracers into the vehicle, and the truck lurched, flamed, and died in a ditch. The second Mustang raked the wreckage and snapped back up, then spotted more movement. Another truck, from a different direction. A motorcycle with a sidecar on a narrow track. The Germans were converging like a closing net. In the field, Priest stood in his cockpit and stared at the tree line, waiting for Marshall to appear. Smoke rose from the woods where the commander had gone down. Somewhere in there, Marshall would be destroying what he could, burning or disabling equipment the Germans would love to capture. Time was collapsing. Every minute on the ground made takeoff harder. The ruts deepened under the wheels. The soft field stole acceleration. Add a second man, and the Mustang's already marginal takeoff would become a gamble. Then Priest saw movement. A figure burst from the trees and ran toward the aircraft. It was Marshall, soot-streaked, furious, and waving his arms. Not waving hello. Waving leave. He was shouting for Priest to get out, to save himself, to obey the order at last. Priest answered without words. He climbed down, unbuckled his parachute harness, and dropped it where Marshall could see it. Then he pulled off what he could, survival gear, anything that stole space and weight, and threw it into the wheat. It was a declaration. I'm not leaving without you, and I'm removing my own options to prove it. Marshall slowed, staring at the discarded gear. Beyond him, helmets were starting to bob above the wheat line. German soldiers advancing on foot now, spreading out, using the field as cover. Overhead, the escort pilots had spent most of their ammunition burning vehicles to buy time. They could make another pass, maybe two, but they couldn't hold the field forever. Marshall sprinted the last distance. The P-51 cockpit wasn't built for passengers. It was a tight space designed around one pilot, one seat, one set of controls, one parachute pack, one man's shoulders under a canopy. Marshall climbed onto the wing and folded himself down first, forcing his body into a position that barely made sense. Legs tucked forward, torso pressed back. Then Priest climbed in and found there was only one way this could work. Bodies stacked, cramped, breathing shallow, controls wedged between knees. They didn't have room to be comfortable. They only had room to be alive. Priest pulled the canopy down. It latched with almost no clearance. Heat immediately built inside like a glass house. Sweat started before they were even moving. Priest pushed the throttle forward. The Merlin roared, and the Mustang lurched through the wheat, heavy and unwilling. The acceleration was wrong, sluggish, dragged down by soft ground and extra weight. The field seemed to shrink in front of them. The tree line at the far end grew larger, faster. A normal Mustang would lift cleanly at a predictable speed. This one felt like it was trying to refuse. Airspeed climbed. The end of the field rushed closer. Priest kept the nose where it needed to be, fighting the urge to yank back too early. If he pulled too soon, they'd stall and crash into the trees. If he waited too long, they'd plow into the trees anyway. When the needle finally crept high enough, he eased back. The wheels left the ground, and the aircraft staggered into the air like a wounded animal. The treetops slid beneath them with terrifying closeness. Branches brushed the belly. Then the Mustang was clear, climbing slowly. Two men inside a machine designed for one, escaping a field that was already filling with German soldiers. Behind them, the Germans spilled out of the wheat and watched the aircraft claw westward. But survival wasn't guaranteed just because they were airborne. The Mustang was overweight and stressed. The engine was running hot and the radiator had swallowed debris during the ground roll. The escort pilots formed up, one on each side, their mission no longer attack but shepherding, watching for threats, guiding the overloaded aircraft through hostile air. Priest eased power back to keep temperatures from spiking, then nudged it forward again when he feared losing time. Every choice was a trade. Slow down to save the engine or push on and risk it cooking itself. Inside the cockpit, the physical suffering turned into something else. Numbness, pins and needles, legs going dead under pressure. Marshall couldn't shift. Priest's movements were restricted. Even small control inputs had to be measured, A sudden jolt could jam the stick against bodies and gear. Outside, occupied France rolled beneath them. Roads, farmsteads, patchwork fields that offered nowhere to hide if the engine quit. Flak positions dotted the route. Luftwaffe airfields could still scramble fighters if they were spotted. The safest path was a narrow line between too low and too high. The temperature needle kept climbing. Eventually, the coastline came into view. The moment it appeared, something changed psychologically. They were finally at the edge of occupied territory, at the boundary, where a forced landing didn't automatically mean capture. But then the English Channel stretched ahead. Cold water, unforgiving distance, and no lifeboat. Priest had thrown his away to make the rescue possible. Marshals had been left behind with the wreck. If the Mustang went down in the channel, survival would be measured in minutes. The engine ran hotter still. It began to sound different, subtle at first, then more obvious. A roughness in the note, a stutter that hinted at cylinders unhappy with the heat. Priest kept going. Better to reach water where rescue might find them than to lose the engine of a France where German patrols would arrive first. Through haze, England appeared. Cliffs, fields, the soft geometry of home. The Mustang crossed the coast still running, and for the first time since the wheat field, Priest allowed himself to believe they might actually land this thing. But the airfield was still ahead. The engine was still sick. And now the stress shifted again. It wasn't about outrunning Germans anymore. It was about coaxing a dying machine onto a runway. The Merlin began to misfire more noticeably as they approached. Priest adjusted mixture, kept speed high enough to maintain lift under the extra weight, and set up for a fast landing. In the distance, the base was already reacting. Vehicles positioned along the runway. People watching an aircraft that shouldn't exist. You dropped the gear. The wheels locked with a solid conformation. Flaps came down. The Mustang floated, then settled. Concrete rose up. The wheels touched, and the aircraft rolled straight, decelerating with a strained cough from the engine that had been asked to do the impossible. Priest braked and stopped. Only then did he let the Merlin die. Ground crew ran toward the plane expecting one exhausted pilot, maybe wounded, maybe barely conscious. Instead, they watched two men unfold from a single-seat fighter like a trick, like physics had been temporarily rewritten. Marshall couldn't stand. Blood flow had been crushed out of his legs for nearly the entire flight. When he tried to move, he collapsed, and hands caught him, lifted him, carried him toward medical help. Priest climbed down under his own power, shaking, drenched, adrenaline still roaring through him. The evidence was everywhere. Wheat jammed into openings, debris packed into the radiator area, streaks of oil, the smell of heat and stress. Mechanics would spend days cleaning, inspecting, replacing lines, stripping packed vegetation out of places it should never have reached. Within hours, the story spread across the group. Then it spread higher, and with the admiration came a problem. Priest had ignored orders in combat. Twice, he had risked a valuable aircraft and the life of a second pilot on a rescue that doctrine didn't support and leadership couldn't easily condone. But he had also brought back a squadron commander, an ace, a leader, a pilot whose loss would have mattered far beyond one mission. Somewhere in command, the question formed the way it always does when war collides with regulations. Do you punish what can't be allowed, or do you honor what saved a man everyone thought was already gone? James Doolittle understood the shape of this problem the moment it reached his desk. 2 years earlier, he had led a mission that looked like madness on paper. Bombers launched from a carrier with no realistic way to return the same way they came. The plan demanded sacrifice, improvisation, and a willingness to accept that aircraft would be lost. He had braced for punishment. Instead, the country called it heroism. Now he was staring at a different version of the same dilemma. A young fighter pilot had gambled everything on an unauthorized act and, against every reasonable expectation, won. Doolittle asked for everything: the mission paperwork, the escort pilot statements, the maintenance notes, the radio chatter that survived, the engineering details on what condition the P-51 was in when it staggered back over friendly ground. He wanted the story stripped down to what could be proven. Not rumors, not legend. What actually happened. What he saw was both simple and dangerous. Royce Priest had been told to break off. He didn't. He had been told again, more urgently, more personally, and still he didn't. Military discipline wasn't a philosophical concept to Doolittle. It was the spine of every operation he'd ever commanded. You don't get formations over enemy territory, timed strikes, coordinated escorts, and men returning home by encouraging everyone to invent their own rules mid-mission. Disobeying a lawful order in combat wasn't a small infraction. It was the kind of thing commanders were supposed to crush quickly before it became contagious. One pilot deciding he knew better could become 10. 10 could become chaos. And yet Doolittle also knew something the regulations couldn't quantify. The air war was chewing through experience at a rate no training pipeline could match. Every pilot who lived through another mission mattered, not just as a body, but as a multiplier for the men flying beside him. A survivor could teach, lead, calm panic, make decisions under pressure, bring others back alive. The man Priest had brought home wasn't a random name on a roster. He was a commander, an ace, a rising figure with a reputation for aggressive leadership. Losing him to capture would have cost more than one cockpit. It would have cost morale, confidence, and time. 3 things you could never stockpile. There was also the human factor that war tries to pretend it can ignore. Pilots flew better when they believed they weren't disposable. They flew harder when they believed someone might do the impossible to get them back. That belief couldn't be written into an operations manual, but Doolittle could feel its weight. He had seen units fight differently when hope and loyalty were alive inside them. So he weighed the options the way only a commander can, coldly, carefully, knowing that any decision would echo. Punish Priest and send a message that discipline mattered more than anything else. Or reward Priest and risk turning reckless heroics into a trend that would cost aircraft, lives, and possibly entire missions. For days, the decision sat there like a live wire. The details were unprecedented. Other men had tried desperate landings in enemy territory before. The math almost always turned cruel. 2 captives instead of 1. 2 wrecks instead of 1. Another grave carved into the ledger. Priest had been the rare exception. He had threaded a needle no one was supposed to attempt. Doolittle made his choice. There would be no court-martial, but there would also be no message sent to the entire Air Force that this was now the standard to live up to. He approved a decoration that acknowledged extraordinary courage without turning the act into doctrine. An award that said plainly, this was valor, and also just as plainly, do not assume you can repeat it and survive. When the paperwork began moving, word spread faster than the forms could. Men talked, ground crews talked, pilots talked. The story grew in the telling because it had to. A single-seat fighter carrying 2 men home sounded like something from a tall tale, not something that happened on a random afternoon over France. When the day came for the presentation, the airfield felt different. Not ceremonial, like a parade, more like a unit gathering around a truth it didn't have words for. A young lieutenant stepped forward to receive a cross that hung heavy with meaning. The general who pinned it on him wasn't just handing out metal. He was shaping what would happen next. The message, spoken or unspoken, was clear enough for every man watching. What Priest had done was brave, and it was also the kind of bravery that could destroy a unit if too many men tried to copy it. Priest didn't argue. He didn't demand more. By all accounts, he'd expected punishment, not praise. The uncertainty afterward, the waiting, the not knowing whether he would be ruined for what he'd done, hung over him like a second mission he couldn't fly his way out of. In later years, when he wrote about it, he admitted something that surprises people. The flight itself was terrifying, but the days after were worse. On the day of the rescue, his body had been too busy surviving to process fear. Afterward, the fear had time to arrive. The rescue became a story that lived inside the 8th Air Force the way legends do, passed from squadron to squadron, pilot to pilot, often told in mess halls with a tone that shifted between disbelief and pride. It gained a nickname. It became shorthand for a kind of loyalty that didn't ask permission. And like all legends, it had consequences. In the months that followed, other men tried similar landings. Some didn't even get airborne again. Some managed to avoid capture only by abandoning the aircraft and disappearing into fields and villages, moving at night, trusting strangers, walking toward friendly lines, step by step. Some succeeded. Some made the loss worse. That was the brutal balance sheet of impossible rescues. Every success became an inspiration, and every failure became proof of why the rules existed. Command never fully blessed the tactic. Command also never completely outlawed it, because outlawing it would mean admitting it was possible. And admitting it was possible would mean every downed pilot might expect it, might wait for it, might take risks assuming a miracle was coming. So officially, the Air Force kept its hands clean. Unofficially, commanders understood that sometimes a man in the sky makes a decision that paperwork can't touch. As for Bert Marshall, he didn't disappear into the shadows of the story. He returned to duty. He recovered. He kept flying, kept leading, carrying the weight of the day he had tried to order Priest away, and the day Priest refused to listen. That weight became heavier when later attempts inside his orbit ended badly. A precedent is a strange thing. It can save a life once and cost lives later. The war moved on, as it always does. Europe kept burning forward toward an ending no one could see yet. The calendar turned, the missions continued. Men who were alive one week were gone the next. Then one day it ended, suddenly and completely, like a song cut off mid-note. Both Priest and Marshall survived it, and survival, in the long view, is its own kind of aftermath. Priest stayed in uniform long after the wheat fields were a memory. His career stretched into a different world, faster aircraft, new wars, new responsibilities, places that would have sounded unreal to the young lieutenant who once looked at a French field and decided the manuals were wrong. His life took him far from that moment, including assignments abroad, and he built a family and a future that never would have existed if the Merlin engine had quit 10 minutes earlier. He kept the Distinguished Service Cross, but he didn't treat it like a trophy. He rarely spoke about the rescue unless someone asked directly. When he did, he pointed away from himself, toward the escort pilots who had burned their ammunition buying him time, and toward the ground crews who rebuilt a battered aircraft and sent it back into the war. Marshall carried his own version of the story. He continued his career too, and the two men remained bound by something you can't replicate in peacetime, a shared experience, forged in a cockpit barely wide enough for one man, crossing hostile territory with a stressed engine and no margin for error. Decades later, Priest put the story into words with a clarity that only time gives. In a letter, he described the parts that never make it into official citations: the feel of the field, the pressure of the moment, the dread afterward, the strange quiet when the adrenaline finally drained away and left only the realization of what he had done. Most importantly, he wrote about why, not doctrine, not strategy, a simpler reason. Marshall had been his hero before the war ever began. When that aircraft went down in flames, Priest didn't calculate survival odds or weigh regulations. He reacted the way humans sometimes do when the stakes become personal. He refused to let his hero disappear into a prison camp. In the end, the aircraft that carried them home did not become a museum piece. Like most war machines, it served, got repaired, served again, and eventually vanished into the great churn of surplus and scrap and forgotten serial numbers. There is no plaque you can stand in front of that says, "This is where it happened." The story survived anyway. It survived because pilots told it to pilots, because veterans told it to historians, because sons asked fathers, and fathers answered. Because the kind of loyalty that makes a man land behind enemy lines doesn't fade easily in memory, even if the official records reduce it to a few clean sentences. And that's the real end of the story. Not a medal, not a court-martial, a choice made in a wheat field, and the echo of that choice traveling further than anyone in that cockpit could have imagined.